I'm pleased to welcome you to the session on Qualitative 101, sponsored by the Research Committee of SAEM. And I'm Wendy Coates from Harbor, UCLA. And my two partners in crime here, Jody Vogel from Stanford and Mike Gottlieb from Rush. And together we're going to walk you through qualitative research, sort of just the superficial basics, and kind of give you an overview in the 101 vein. So I wanted to start off by just showing you this graphic. When we asked a lot of people who are actually experts in qualitative research to sit down together in a research conference and tell us the one word that they thought of when we said the word qualitative research, well, that's two words, these are the things that they entered into a real-time word cloud generator. And I want you to just take a moment to look at these words. And I also want you, in the same mindset, to think of the word research. And maybe you have a little bit of discomfort from what we usually draw in our minds when we think of research and what these words indicate. And so I think you can formulate your own opinion by looking at these words to see that qualitative research does belong in the same sentence. But it is a very different animal than our regular, more standard quantitative research that most people have been exposed to at length throughout medical school. So the differences are kind of summed up in this slide. I want to point out that qualitative research is as rigorous as quantitative research, but it's just a little bit different. So when we're looking for the answers to qualitative questions, these questions are typically more along the lines of how and why, as opposed to how much or how many. The study design that you start with may have to evolve over time, because when you're starting to get your results, you're like, oh my goodness, this isn't what we expected at all. We need to make some changes. And you have to be flexible enough with that. It's a dynamic reality. It requires you to process things, which all of you as emergency physicians are very good at. You get these complex patients and you come to critical decisions in a time-based fashion. So you're set up to do qualitative research just by nature of what makes you good at your specialty. And it's a little bit, in context with what your specific area is, as opposed to, like, you can read. All those, I'm not going to reread them for you because you should be reading them while I'm talking. So I think that the best way to illustrate this is for us to look at a question and see what the different questions are that we could ask qualitatively and quantitatively. So let's pretend that you're the vice chair for academic affairs at your institution, and you notice that your doctor, one of your doctors, Anna Sarka, had so many fewer manuscripts during the COVID period than every single one of the male counterparts in her department. And you're like, what the heck? And it's not just Dr. Anna, it's a lot of other people too who might be in her same situation. So you decide that your research question is going to focus on, let's look at research characteristics during the COVID-19 pandemic. All right, so great. You can do a research project like this. Clearly, everyone moved to working at home. So the researcher is sitting in the office. It's very comfortable, decorated with all the things like plants that make you do research better, I guess. You know, your own computer. Look, the smile. He hasn't shaved for a month because nobody cares. You know, it's all good. And I don't even know what this is supposed to be, but it makes him happy. So, you know, the clear questions here are, what is the rate of manuscript submission in COVID versus non-COVID time? So that's a purely quantitative research question, right? And do women faculty have lower manuscript productivity than men at the same academic rank? And according to what we saw with Dr. Anna Sarka, that's probably true. Like, we're going to find that, and that's a great quantitative question. Yeah, guess what happened during COVID? Dr. Sarka over there, you can see like what her work environment looks like. She's got the kids running around, everything is a mess, she's got childcare responsibilities, and she's just like having a lot of problems. So maybe some better research questions instead of these might be talking a little bit about, is there a gender gap that was instigated by this, this monster that we all had to deal with? Is it the shift of working from home and having childcare responsibilities and the burdens of running a family and teaching your kids on Zoom school and all of those other things? And maybe you could look at women of different academic ranks, for example, because a senior faculty person whose kids are all out working may not have suffered the same gender-based problems. So those are some qualitative examples. Now, I want to really, if you remember, like, this is the time you turn on your brain to remember some of the key points of the lecture, okay? Here you are. This is a research study, and it has rigor, it has methodology, and we can't just look at qualitative and say, oh, we're not going to do anything rigorous. It's as rigorous. It's very important. The difference with qualitative research is sometimes you don't just go around in that circle starting with identify need and then get to the end. A lot of times you're going around that circle again and again and again and modifying throughout. But all the steps are important, and everything has to be trustworthy and reliable throughout your study. So let's look at a couple examples of qualitative research and some of the words. Remember that word cloud? And maybe you thought of some different words that could have been added to that word cloud. So in this study, for those of you in Armed Med Ed or thinking of Armed Med Ed, the first step about creating that course was to find out what the hardcore science emergency care researchers did back in the 1990s when everybody in America thought that emergency medicine research was a joke. So it turned out that those researchers and societies like SAEM and ACEP really stepped up, and they identified some key features that made emergency care research thrive as it is today. So maybe education research can do the same thing, and we learned a lot from these pioneers through interviews. And you can see the words highlighted that are not typical for a quantitative study, but we found out a lot of good information that you need knowledge, mentorship, and networks to succeed in any kind of research. This is another interesting one, exploring motivations of residents, explaining things, describing things, and then they go ahead and talk about some of the future work that might be done as a result of the things they discovered. And that highlights one of the other most critical points. So here it is again. Remember, like, take-home point number 2 is one of the main reasons that people do qualitative research is to inform a hypothesis testing study down the road, because you don't want to invest all that money and energy into something that is like that first question with the guy sitting there quietly and not having the problem. So the qualitative study leads you there. I'm going to turn it over right now to Jody. This is one last one that you can just read while we're transitioning here, again with similar kinds of words.
Great, thank you, Wendy. Now that we've heard a little bit more about what makes the difference between quantitative and qualitative, I just wanted to talk a little bit about research paradigms. So there are a lot of different research paradigms. We're only going to touch on a few here today, but these are the constructs that you can use to help develop your study and your approach. So the first one I want to talk a little bit about is positivism. And so this approach is under the impression that there's a single true reality. And it's based on deductive reasoning. And what it suggests is that you can predict things through observation and measurement. So for example, we'll use imposter syndrome just as our example today. So for this particular construct, what is the prevalence of imposter syndrome would be the type of question that you would ask using this approach or theory-based approach. Something very specific where the researcher is detached and it's independent and the context itself is not important. The other one I wanted to cover today is post-positivism. So similar to positivism, but in this circumstance, they believe that not everything is completely knowable. So things are a little bit more, able to be considered or impact the outcome of the study or what's occurring with your members. So for imposter syndrome, as our example, one question might be what factors contribute to imposter syndrome in physicians? So looking at different things, and the context and the researcher themselves can influence the research. So for example, if I think every woman has imposter syndrome, then that would impact how I approach the study. And so that's something to keep in mind using this theoretical concept. Constructivism Interpretism. So this approach suggests that there are multiple realities. And our work to do that, or our work to investigate that, the context frames the reality. And this really is about lived experience. And you might think about this a lot with qualitative research, because we think about what are people experiencing. We want to learn more about that the quantitative data may not be able to share with us. And in this circumstance, the researcher and the participant co-construct the findings. And so in this circumstance, for the imposter syndrome example, one question we might ask is, how does imposter syndrome affect the lives of physicians who are experiencing it? So we're looking at what is the experience, what are they experiencing, and that may help guide our decisions. For myself, I've done research on frequent emergency department visitors, and it was very interesting to talk with them using this approach because, everyone thinks, well, they just keep coming here. But to understand really why they come, their perception of the emergency department is very different, probably than our perception as providers. It made all the difference to talk with them, meet with them, and really understand. I mean, they see us as, a place they can go any time, and they actually have what in their minds a social connection with us. It was very interesting, and that's information I never would have been able to obtain just using the quantitative approach. And then finally, the critical ideological. So this is more focused on social change. So a question that you might ask in this context using the imposter syndrome example is, how are women impacted in a different way than men for imposter syndrome? Or the reverse, depending on what your theory is and what your hypothesis is for your study. And so I'm going to touch on just a few qualitative designs. There are numerous, but just to give you a broad overview today at this introductory section. So case study is one approach. So for the imposter syndrome example, you might say, well, what are the experiences of 4 medical students who have imposter syndrome? A very focused group. Ethnography is interesting because it talks about the culture and the way people exist in groups. So an example for an ethnography is how is a physician perceived within a group, or how is the emergency care physician perceived among frequent emergency department visitors? So it's a context, or within their community. And narrative research. So the slide says everyone has a story. We all have stories, and that's great. So the approach with this one is to look at what is the individual's story. So what is the experience of being a physician across one's lifespan? What does that mean? And it would be different for each person, but interesting based on the individuals you would be meeting with. And then grounded theory, which I've used frequently in my research, is where I use the data to develop a theory about what's happening. So for frequent emergency department visitors, we collected data. You can see on the left of the slide, data collection. Then we did some open coding just to get some general themes about what we thought was going on. Went back and did axial coding, trying to find the relationships between the concepts that we were identifying, and then finally selective coding. But you can see the arrows, everything is going back and forth. So we would do some coding, we would reconsider and go back and re-review the transcripts. So it's an ongoing process. And then phenomenology seeks to understand the outside world as it's interpreted by humans. So in this circumstance, you see a group of people. So this is a little bit different in narrative in that it looks at a group of people. So an example for this might be something like, why do medical students generally go to residencies in their local area or near, close to their family, that type of thing. What's the group experience? And then finally, participatory action research, where you're evaluating something, you're reflecting, observing, and acting. So an example here might be, how do we recruit and retain underrepresented medicine faculty? That's particularly relevant to my position in academic affairs. And I'll turn it over to Mike to provide a little more information about qualitative study design.
Thanks. All right, so building on Dr. Coates and Dr. Vogel, what they've done, I want to talk about how do we do this, right? This is amazing. It sounds really interesting and fascinating, and how do I actually operationalize it? Now, before we get into that, when I say qualitative research, what do you envision? What do you think happens? Say it louder. All right, it's intimidating. Well, we're going to find that out. What do you envision? People, things. What's your picture of happening? Talking to people. Absolutely. What else? What other forms are there? Oh yeah, a survey. What else? Focus groups. I love it. Anything else? Interviews. All right. What else? All right, so we got half of them. So this is reason why is it's often a broader box than we think of. It's absolutely, I think interviews and focus groups are definitely the most common that we see, we talk about. And so we say, yeah, that floats to the top of our minds. Observations is actually kind of cool. Right? You're actually watching this in real time. You're taking copious notes, right? You're like Jane Goodall, you're watching and seeing what's happening, and you're saying, I noticed that you did this and this and this. Like if I'm trying to study and figure out why in the world does no one ever submit their ultrasound exams? Why are all the exams being done and not one person can submit them into QPath? Well, I can ask them, and I might get a meek response of, I'm too busy, or I could watch them and see what happens and take all these copious notes, right? That's a field study. I can go ahead and I can have them complete a survey, and oftentimes people do a survey and they're like, oh, people put response in there, I did a mixed methods. But to do true mixed methods means you do real qual work, which means you're going to actually go through and do a thematic analysis of what they wrote. So we can get in a survey, and we can do intentional, really heavily qualitatively focused surveys, or just surveys that have some qualitative components. And the last one is, remember that we don't always have to solicit explicitly to get qualitative information. Let's say I wanted to find if there was a gender bias in the words used on the medical student SLO letter. I could look through existing SLOs. I could do what's called linguistic analysis and look at how things are framed and identify codes across there. And if I do that with proper methodologies, that's qualitative. So not all qualitative is sitting there going in an interview one-on-one. It's actually a variety of different approaches that we can use. And the key is the methodology to be true to what we're doing. All right, now let's talk about sampling. This is in the context of something where we're going to seek out people. If I'm going to seek out people, it has to reflect the data I want to find, which means I have to be thoughtful about how I sample. What's the magic word when we do a quantitative study to make sure we have enough people? What do we say? We need a power. We need a power. We need a sample size. That doesn't exist. That's a quantitative word, right? In qualitative, it's the flip. In quantitative, we say, you know what? I need to meet X number of people, and then I am adequately powered. In qualitative, I don't know I'm powered till I'm there. It's kind of a little surreal for the quantitatively skewed people because we're like, wait a second, you mean I don't know how many people I'm going to need? No, you don't. You might get there at 8 people. Win. You might get there at 27 people. Less win. And you're going to find a space of like, this is when I reach what's called either saturation or sufficiency. So saturation is an older term. Saturation is almost a positivist term, meaning it's discrete. Like, I have actually saturated all the available information. But we know that 8 or 27 or 100 people doesn't reflect all the people that exist. Just at some point, it's sufficiently broad that you're capturing most information. Sufficiency, right? So as we're going through it, we're going to say, all right, I want to make sure I reach sufficiency. The second piece I want to do is I want to make sure I've captured all the opinions I want. If I wanted to do a study and say, what has been the experience, the lived experience of an EM resident during COVID-19, I'm going to study all PGY2s at Rush Emergency Medicine. That must represent everyone. No, it doesn't at all. It's a subset of a population. So I might say, you know what? Maybe Chicago was different than New York, was different than California. Now I can get more broad. Maybe being a PGY2 who's already had a year under their belt pre-COVID had a different experience than a PGY1 who's never known anything else, than a PGY3 who was on their way out and they're like, I just want to do this one procedure and I never got to because of COVID. It's a lived different experience. We have to start to stratify that. I want to make sure I have good gender, I want a good race, good ethnicity diversity. And depending on the study, thinking about every single component of it. Is it a type of program? Is it a different types of lived experience? Is it different specialties? We want to be thoughtful to make sure that we're actually capturing enough of that. And that's where we'll stratify and we'll do what's called purposive sampling. We'll say, I want to get this number of each type of person to fit into this range to make sure I'm actually getting a better sense of their lived experiences and not just one skew of the population. Yes?
Are you going so far, because that's first I've heard that term, are you going so far as to use the word sufficiency in your grants and in your publications? Like, is it at the level of generalized accessibility?
There are publications by leading experts who do use that term. I will say I've used both. I don't feel in the publication it probably matters particularly much. It's often going to be the reviewer. So whichever one I choose will probably be what reviewer 2 disagrees with. So if I say sufficiency, I'll be like, actually, it's saturation. And if I say saturation, I'll be like, have you heard about sufficiency? Whatever I choose will be there, but that will never be a fatal flaw of the manuscript. It's just, it's a purely theoretical piece because it won't change your end product. Great question. I love questions. Ask away as they come up. I am totally open. I think that's a great way we can kind of make sure we're answering questions in real time. All right. So as Dr. Coates mentioned, this is rigorous. I will say it again because it's like hard to get past this when you're like, well, you don't know how people are getting advanced. It seems a little bit more of a softer science at first glance. True qualitative, well-done research is rigorous and is a lot of work. It is actually more work than quantitative. But if you do it well, it can be really impactful. I think there were some phenomenal examples that were laid out, and we say, how do we better understand this construct? I can do 5,000 surveys. I won't answer the question I want. And then I'll just waste time with people's surveys. I want to get to the root of it. I want to understand the questions that matter. And because I am not you or you or you or you, I can't understand your mindset in the way other than predicting what I think. If I want to actually understand it, I have to ask. Qualitative is amazing that way. Now, there's a set of guidelines called the SRQR. I do not want you to read the screen. I just want you to be familiar with, like, this is what it looks like. This is what the guidelines lay out. Do not spend any time reading it. I will stand in front of here if I see anyone reading it. I want you to be aware that this is what it looks like because it's a guideline that exists that has words on it, that gives you descriptions and discussions like any other guideline. You now know that a thing exists when you're writing your qualitative study that you will look at that will have information on it. That's why this exists. You know that it'll have not just a do units of study. It says, this is what units of study entails. And you can go back to this when you're ready to do your study and actually call this back and say, okay, now I want a refresher. I'm making sure I'm checking off each of these. This is a guideline to inform how you do your qualitative work. Now, when we talk about qualitative, we have 2 words. We like the terms authenticity and trustworthiness. They have some parallels to things we're more familiar with, like validity and reliability. But what authenticity says is authenticity says the data is accurate. Trustworthiness says you analyze correctly. Okay, so authenticity, that means that if I'm doing a recipe, I got all the ingredients right. I got the right amounts. Okay? I'm going to bake something. I'm getting all my ingredients there. But if I decide to put them in completely the wrong order, I put the flour and I put the flour immediately into the oven, and then after it's done cooking the flour, I now add the baking soda. I had all the right ingredients, but I totally analyzed it incorrectly. And that will not make a cake. That will make a disgusting amalgamation of flour and burnt stuff. But you have to analyze it correctly, and they have to go hand in hand. The same thing, if I go ahead and I'm like, all right, I know exactly how long, I know everything has to go in there, so I'm going to put a teaspoon of flour and a pound of baking soda, but I put them in the oven for the right time, and I stir them around, I still have incoherent data. They have to go hand in hand, authenticity and trustworthiness, and here's how they do. All right, so we have authenticity. Authenticity is saying, again, how good is the data? So it starts with how well do we sample? That's what we said before. Are we sampling correctly? Are we capturing patients who have a broad range of opinions? Triangulation is a cool one. So triangulation actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it. It's triangulate. You're coming from different angles. So what it's saying is that if I really want to understand this, I need to see it from different lenses. So maybe a better way, if I wanted to understand why, again, no one will seem to ever save their ultrasound scans. I'm going to watch them, then I'm going to ask them, and maybe I'll do a survey, and I'll start to triangulate information, so now I'm seeing it from multiple sides, right? Like there's so many images where they show like someone, it's some variant of someone doing something really ridiculous, and then you turn from the other side and they're doing something totally appropriate because we only saw from one lens. It's the one view is no view approach. Right? We need to see things from multiple angles. That's where triangulation comes into play. The data collection, did I actually collect it well? Did I conduct an interview that was more open than closed? Did I lead them? Did I subject them to my biases? It's a different question if I say, do you believe there's a gender bias? Than, how do you feel that gender affects your publications? They may end up with the same answer, but by doing the first question, I lead a direction. I lead it with what my opinion may be instead of what theirs is. I go open. And then I clarify with them to make sure I understand what they're saying. So if they say something and I'm like, I'm not sure I understand what they're saying, I will ask them that. And during my interview, I will say, can you expand upon that? Can you clarify that? I don't say, did you mean this? I will say, can you clarify that? Or I will confirm if I'm like, I feel pretty aligned with what they say, then I'll confirm, I'm hearing this, is that correct? I give them the opportunity to make sure that I'm hearing what they have to say, not what I think they should say. You want to be able to have enough of a step of a relationship. If you're going to engage with them, let's say I'm working with learners and I'm going to interview them, I can't really interview my residents because they will be biased to say what they think I want, right? If I'm trying to convince them to do more ultrasound scans that are labeled into there and I say, well, why do you feel you're not, or why do you feel that the ultrasound scans aren't being saved? No, you're doing everything great, Dr. Gottlieb. I feel like you're doing everything great. It's not your fault. There's a difference of a power structure, right? So I will ask someone who stepped away to make sure that they can feel safe to be honest and be like, actually, Dr. Gottlieb's process is way too complicated. But they won't tell me that. They need to be stepped away. They need to have a separated relationship to feel comfortable. And then trustworthiness, how well are we analyzing it? What's our analytic process? And we're going to go into that a little bit more when we talk about coding. But in short, you need more than one person, and you need more than one viewpoint. So if I'm going to do that same exact study that I'm carrying through, maybe one of you will do an answer for me. But as I'm doing that same study, I'm going to ask someone who is a medical student. I'm going to ask someone who is maybe a PhD, someone who stepped away from the process to give me a clearer lens because we're all too close to it. And that's actually what I routinely will do with most of my studies is I will engage a medical student or a resident, depending on what the level of study is, someone who stepped away from that learner level. And I will generally engage a PhD or a non-EM physician into my studies to lend that lens to make sure that what I'm saying is really separated from our bias and we're seeing those multiple lenses. And I will say the last kind of thing here is use software. Please use software. I've done it by Excel. It's really painful. There is software out there. It is not particularly expensive. I'm not going to name them all out, but I will say for the sake of argument that they range from $15 to over $100. The less expensive ones are fine. Choose the less expensive ones. There are more nuances to the more expensive ones. Just use something because using Excel, it is not worth saving $15. I will say this again. No matter what level you are, $15 is worth not using Excel. You can do it. All right. With that, I'm going to pass along Dr. Coates.
Thank you.
When you say you need many people to analyze the data, some people say there is really one person that is going to read the data transcript and that is familiar with it, and other people, viewers, would add their personal bias without knowing the data. So is that really better to have many people?
We're going to talk about that right now. You are like an audience plant. Thank you for that segue. That's a great question. We're going to talk about coding. All right, so this is like a really cool thing because you have a chance to sit down and interpret things that people said. I want to remind you that you have the QR code that has the articles in a Dropbox that are curated for you, lots of articles about qualitative research. So the first one is like taking your qualitative research to the next level. If you read that one, that gives you the thorough overview. Like if you wanted to spend an hour like learning everything about all the things you've heard today and just like have everything laid out for you, that's the paper for you. Then there's a series of 3 that I think are at the top, talking about how to interview, how to code, and how to use technology, like some of those programs that Mike was talking about, to help you code. So what we're trying to do with coding is we're trying to make sense out of what all these people have said. So basically, when I talk to people and I interview them, like we start here and then it takes us all this time, we get all the way over here and I'm like, oh my gosh, what did they say back there? I have this mountain of data, what in the heck am I supposed to do? So often, like Mike was saying, I will pick a medical student, an undergraduate student. If I'm lucky and I have a grant, I'll hire a professional transcriptionist, or I will have a chance to get a PhD student. This is an amazing resource. You all come from academic institutions, and many of those academic institutions have MPH programs. They have biostats people who are getting PhDs in things like epidemiology. And every single one of those people needs a project where they can be an author on a paper or a meaningful participant in a research project. And so you don't have to pay them, except you can offer them authorship if they contribute enough. And then they'll do all your data analysis with you and all your statistics for you. And that goes for any kind of research. So basically, these are some of the ways that you can code, and just I don't know, it's just, you can take a bunch of people and they can all sit in a room by themselves and then they can code. You can have people say, I am going to analyze every single word in the sentence. And they said 5 times, that means they're not sure. And then you have some other people who look at the coding and it's like, yeah, this guy was just kind of, I don't know. He was just disgruntled. So there might be a whole big old paragraph in that one, and then your code for that is disgruntled. Somebody else would code that same thing like angry, and then he gets to the next word, and then they say, fed up or whatever, and then there's 20 codes that really, when you boil it all down, it's going to say disgruntled. So basically, I'm not going to spend time explaining all the definitions of those, just to show you that there's not just one way to do this. But I wanted to call attention to this diagram. So what this does is it's kind of a flow chart of how you conduct your study. So first you come up with your research question, you develop a conceptual framework like you do for any study before you start. You come up with the methods, you collect your data, and then you start analyzing it. You can kind of go then from the analysis to maybe a little bit of a descriptive analysis, like, hey guys, team, what kind of happened here? What do we think? What do we need to do next? And then we analyze qualitatively with the coding. And what I generally like to do is I like to have some, maybe 2 people or 3 people analyze 1 or 2 transcripts, and just one, okay? So, we each take 1 transcript and we each code it, and just sort of a preliminary thing, what do you think? And then we meet back together. And in case we're on 3 polar opposite places, we need to talk about how we're going to analyze it, because each one takes a really long time, okay? So we want to meet back together. And then we assess, maybe we go back and say, let's look at every single one of the transcripts now. We feel like we're kind of cool. We've set up a scheme here. And then we look for saturation. Well, sometimes everything is new. Every person you talk to is telling you something new. Well, that means you're not done. You need to go find more people. And then that's when we go back up there to collecting the data. And this hopefully is not an endless loop, because you've defined your research question in a narrow enough fashion so that it isn't like that. But once we achieve saturation, we do some formal coding, and we have our coders. They meet together, they go over the scheme. There's some sort of a code book, or there's a computerized instruction of how the program that you use, like in Vivo or something, on how to actually code it. And then you're always going to have disputes. So you meet together over usually some wine, and then you're like, no, I think it should be And the other person, have a drink. Okay. No, really, you can always negotiate with one another, I think it's like this. No, but I think it's like that. And, well, why do you think that? Well, this. Oh, I didn't even think about it like that. Okay. That's a little bit more how it goes. But the wine actually does make it a more pleasant experience. You identify the themes, you interpret the data, and you draw conclusions. So, let's do it. You might want to have a buddy because this could be really boring by yourself. We're going to skip over a lot of steps because we have 15 minutes, and I do want to hear what you have to say. All right, so this particular exercise is based on, let's pretend that you, the researcher, are the director of the rotator in your emergency department. Many people would run far before they took on that role because it's a very complex role, welcoming people into the department with a number of backgrounds. So then you decide, well, what's this? You want to find out things about this experience of the rotator in your emergency department. So these are non-emergency medicine residents, interns, whatever, and you want to see what their experience has been like. So on the top of that page, it says the question, which is, how do you perceive your role as a team member in the EV? So what I'm going to say is, this is probably one of maybe 10 questions. And you interview these people, and this is your first question, or something like that. And you had 12 residents, and these are the things that they said. So what I want you to do is look through them and see if there's some things that you can identify when you look through these. And you can do it with a buddy because it's more fun that way. And just kind of figure out how you're gonna summarize all this stuff in your research meeting. Yeah. Yeah, and then 15 minutes left for the whole exercise. And however far you're thinking. You were thinking what? Oh, yeah. Yeah, 5 minutes you have. Just like, this is big picture. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.